if they want to. Talk don't bother me. I want the
Okay, so we're here at City Lord Gallery on First Street, which is currently hosting a show called Artwork, which is about a very important project that happened in 1978 and 79, during which the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act employed 600 artists in New York City, full-time, for 2 years. And I was lucky enough to be one of those artists. So we are at the entrance to the exhibition here, and we have a wonderful blow-up photo of a CETA artist, a dancer, working with children in the public library in Jamaica, New York. Her name was Naz Hosseini, and the photograph was taken by my colleague on the documentation unit, Sarah Wells, a wonderful creative person who unfortunately died way, way too young of cancer around 1990 or so. Okay, CETA was an employment program created by the federal government. It was the largest it was the largest project of its type since the WPA of the 1930s. It was put together in 1973 because there was terrible inflation and terrible unemployment at the time. So bad that there was able to be a cooperation between the Democrats and the Republicans to create a program, and Richard Nixon actually signed it into law in 1973. The reason the Republicans could accept it was it wasn't unified at the federal level. It was distributed in block grants to states who had a lot of say about how the money was used. And then it was redistributed to cities, counties, Indian reservations, and other smaller venues so that the money could be used at the local level. This exhibition is the culmination of 5 years of work by a group of us who had been CETA artists. We began to think it would be really great to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the project, meaning in 2018. We didn't quite bring that about, but we did get several things to happen in 2019, including some panels at the College Art Association, some involvement from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and eventually we got City Lord Gallery and its curator, Molly Garfinkel, involved, and they have become a major force in helping us organize what we call the CETA Legacy Project. With the coming of the pandemic and the real setback for the cultural sector in 2020, it became apparent to us that this idea of CETA and as a way for funding the cultural sector became even more important, because everybody was talking about the WPA, but that was back in the 1930s. CETA was only in the late 1970s, and it's a much better model for how to funnel money to the cultural sector. Okay, this is the first wall of the show, and it talks about the origin of the CETA project. And CETA, as I said, was created in 1973. It went into effect in 1974. It was never intended to hire artists or people in the arts. But a brilliant man named John Creedler, who was in San Francisco at the time, and knew the program and the legislation very well, said there's no reason this can't employ artists, because artists are workers. So rather than be a grant program, it will be a program to employ artists to do work, and to do work specifically in the community sector. And so in 1974, San Francisco launched the first CETA Artist Project, mostly creating murals and working in classrooms, doing workshops.
And what are some of the exhibits here? I notice a newspaper article, for example. Maybe we'll begin here with this newspaper article
Okay, well, New York City was the last major city to create a CETA project. So in some ways, ours was the best. It had the wisdom of 4 years of CETA projects before it. This is a New York Times article from 1977 announcing that the CETA Artist Project will start. It says U.S. hiring 300 artists for a year to work on community projects.
And what is this?
This little TV here presents a video of a program in Washington, D.C. where basically CETA Arts funding was first announced. And there was a lot of support in the federal government, especially at the level of the Department of Labor. And the Assistant Secretary of the Department of Labor, Ernest Green, was a great fan of using CETA money to employ artists and to create arts projects in the cities.
And what are some of these photographs here?
These photographs show the very first day of the New York City CCF CETA Artist Project, when we got together to do our paperwork, to sit together in an auditorium at Fashion Institute of Technology and listen to a lot of speeches about how the program was going to work. The Commissioner of Cultural Affairs of New York at the time, Henry Geldsaller, was there, and as were all of the new CETA employees. This is where a little bit before that, this is when the paperwork was being done. And some of the people here were volunteers. In fact, he was the husband of one of the CETA administrators who volunteered to just come in and helped process the applications of the various artists. Over 3,000 artists applied for what eventually became 300 positions. And the hiring process was very rigorous. It involved, going through a resume. It involved an interview. It involved putting you before a professional panel that would evaluate the quality of your work. Would evaluate whether you might be a good teacher in a community setting, and made sure that you had not earned too much money in the previous year in order to qualify for CETA funding. Present tense here, this panel talks about how the New York City projects knew that it was very important to represent themselves, to document themselves. So for example, the CCF project, the largest project for which I worked, had a full documentation unit. This is me as a 25-year-old up here with 3 other photographers, 3 writers, and an archivist. And we were going to travel all over the city documenting the workshops, the classrooms, the artists in their studios, the dance performances, the music performances, and so forth. But there were several New York City projects that were not under CCF. One was under the American Jewish Congress, for example. One was under Enfoco Gallery up in the Bronx. And one was under the Brooklyn Arts and Cultural Association. So this panel tells us that there were many, many parts to the CETA employment of artists in New York City. We were paid $10,000 a year, plus health benefits, plus vacation time. If you do the conversion to the current day, that's about $45,000 a year. You tell people that artists were employed by the government for $45,000 a year, they're astonished. They really can't believe it in the modern setting, right? But immediately, as we started the project, we knew we had to work hard to get it renewed for a second year. So the artists organized themselves into the CETA Artist Organization. CETA workers of all sorts around the city, not just artists, organized themselves into the CETA Workers Organization. And we began to protest, we began to have demonstrations, we began to put pressure on politicians to renew the project. So we had 1978, and we were pushing to have 1979 as well, and we were successful. Not only did we get the project continued, but we got additional lines for 1979 because we were very successful, we were very efficient, and we documented ourselves very well. Windfall, and it shows the demonstrations that the artists had to have in order to try to continue the program. And once we knew the program was going to end, around the beginning of 1980, the project gave us lots of coaching in terms of how to go out and get jobs post-project. It also taught us how to apply for unemployment, which I have to tell you is a very important skill for artists that we took through the rest of our lives. These are various news releases from supporters, like Ted Weiss in New York, who wanted to continue the project. This is an example of what we called payday news. We got every 2 weeks at our payday to tell us what was going on in the project, what to watch out for. There was a lot of internal communication as well. I'll say that there were 300 artists and 50 administrators, and all 50 administrators were from the arts. They really knew the arts. They knew the communities we were going to work in, and they did a great job of matching artists with community groups they did a great job of working with us to make our jobs go smoothly. Okay, the CETA Arts Administration knew that we had to get out into the public and we had to make our presence and our contribution known. So they organized lots of performances, public performances of dance, of music, of theater. We had a poetry group that went around the schools to teach poetry, and we had visual arts exhibitions, such as Artists by the Sea, which happened twice, once in 1978, once in 1979, at the Snug Harbor Cultural Center in Staten Island. These are some images from the exhibition itself and from the dance performance at the opening of the exhibition. We also produced some beautiful public murals. This was one created by CETA artist Cynthia Melman, and it was created for the World Trade Center. It was right over the entrance to the PATH station for many years until the bombing that happened in 1993, actually the first bombing of the World Trade Center, which destroyed it. 4 other CETA murals on the upper floors of the World Trade Center were destroyed in 2001. So unfortunately, we don't have a great legacy of murals.
How about this picture here? It's interesting. What's going on here?
Okay, this is CETA artist Sue Scher. She was a book artist, and she did a very unusual thing. She did performances with large books that she created, where she would actually leaf through the books and show her audience the books. And looking at her book right here is Joan Mondell, right, the wife of the then vice president. And Joan Mondell was a very big supporter of the arts and came to visit the CETA program several times.
Interesting. And so, well, let's move down this way.
Mm-hmm.
Who is this group of handsome folks?
This group here are some of the CETA administrators that I referred to. They are all artists of various sorts, dancers, performers, literary artists, and visual artists as well. Right here is Sarah Gerritsen. Sarah Gerritsen was the director of the Cultural Council Foundation, a nonprofit that oversaw the project.
Cool. Right, and some more. Here's the payday news you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah, so as I said, we would come together literally in person to get our paychecks bi-weekly. And not only did we get our paychecks, we had great programs. People would come to speak, performers would perform, we'd get to know each other, we'd all go out for a cheap breakfast afterwards. And just some pretty well-known people. This here is Dawood Bey, who was part of the project, and is probably among the top 2 or 3 photographers known in the United States today. This is Robert Gerbo, also a photographer, at the dance party, where we celebrated the project on the very first day of the project.
What were you dancing to?
I wasn't at this particular one. It was at a nightclub.
And how about the classroom scene? It looks like a college classroom up there.
No, that's the auditorium where we were getting our... Up here is the auditorium where we were gathered that particular Friday to get our paychecks and get various updates on the project. Okay, well actually these 2 photos were made by this guy, Robert Gerbo, who I already mentioned, who was sent out to work in the Bronx, in the community, in the parks. This was a group called Foundation for Independent Video and Film. That was part of our project. It had about 13 video artists who would go do documentary projects around the city. Here they're at a city hospital, at a health clinic, doing a piece. Down here, we have a CETA artist doing portraiture on the street in Harlem for an arts festival in Harlem that happens to be my photograph. Here we have my documentary colleague Sarah Wells, who made that large picture we saw at the beginning, doing a documentation of one of the many exhibitions that we put together. On this wall we have kind of the centerpiece of the show, which is a grid of 24 photographs from the project, showing how broadly it was based, how diverse it was. Something I forgot to mention was for 1978, this project was well ahead of the curve in terms of diversity. We represented every race, every ethnicity. We were male and female in pretty equal numbers. We were young and old. We came from all 5 boroughs of the city. And this was partly because we were responsible to the Department of Labor, and we had to meet their standards for diversity at the time. As I come across here, I can just show you some things. This is actually the old Essex Street Market, which is just a few blocks away from where we currently are. We had an artist documenting the Lower East Side. This was by Nina Kuo, whom I think you know, who was assigned to a project about deteriorating buildings around the Lower East Side of Manhattan. This was a dance troupe, Nitsa Tufuyo, who was going around to various schools leading dance workshops. This was in a senior center where one of the CETA dancers was working with the seniors. Again, that Essex Street Market from the outside. A terrific artist, Willie Birch, was in the project. He has become very well known as a painter. He now lives in New Orleans. Candida Alvarez, also a very well-known artist who was part of the project. And another nursing home where Margarita Monk was working regularly with the residents. This is CETA artist Ademola Alegabafola, a great artist who has been part of our panels here at the gallery, and he's working with a student in a high school in Upper Manhattan on a mural project. Up here we have CETA artist Virginia Maximowitz working in the Bronx in an after-school setting. And Virginia was one of the co-founders of the CETA Artist Legacy Project, by the way. Moving over this way, this is some more of that independent video and film crew working to document a major event that took place during the project. This is painter Alan Samelin, who did a beautiful mural for the Queen's Science Center at the time. And this is the Black Theater Alliance doing a project. Further down, we have, as you...
Some folks dancing. It looks like they're rehearsing a Broadway show there.
Yeah, these are some dancers rehearsing for a dance performance. Okay, well, let me just move on to one or two over here. We haven't mentioned yet the Orchestra of New York. 30 very professional orchestra-level musicians were hired and under the aegis of the Brooklyn Philharmonia, and became the Orchestra of New York, and performed all over the place. Here they're performing down in Lower Manhattan. Here they're performing in the sculpture garden of the Museum of Modern Art, right? Here we have a very famous poet named Bob Holman, known as the inventor of the Poetry Slam, who was one of our poets, and still has an active poetry bar on the Bowery, in fact. And
Where is that picture taken?
this picture was taken at a grammar school in Chinatown, actually, when he was doing a poetry workshop with the students. Maybe it was an early poetry slam. I'm not sure. This was one of our documentary journalists, Judd Telly, interviewing one of our artists. And then some of the literary artists and poets came together and formed a group called Words to Go, got a van, and would drive around and go to various schools in various neighborhoods and do poetry readings, do workshops, do all kinds of things for the communities. Here we have another CETA musical group, a small jazz band, performing at the Port Authority Trans Hudson, the Path Terminal in New York City. And here we have the large CETA jazz band rehearsing. Okay, this little alcove presents a video documentation of the project, which is kind of nice because it gives us some color. Most of the show is in black and white, actually. And you can see, just some flavor of the kinds of things that were being done by our artists performing and teaching in workshops. This one is based on traditional Japanese theater and involves forming clay onto someone's face. But on this wall here, there's a slew of letters, most of which were letters coming from the people who were served by the CETA artists, thanking them for coming and working with their community, thanking them for teaching the workshops, thanking them for their dance performances at senior centers. So it's very nice. Some of us were completely surprised to find letters to us thanking us for things we did that we didn't even know existed until Molly from Cedar found them in the archives and made records of them and then enlarged them for the exhibition. Two of the artists in the project had actually worked in the WPA arts projects. So that gives you an idea of the range. And so as I said, we were lucky enough to get in this project and we were in it for 2 years. And it was the most fabulous education you could have. It was far better than graduate school because we just got to interact with 300 artists of every race, ethnicity, age, background, and just get a great education in what it is to be an artist. But we also got to begin to work in community settings. Each of us taught many workshops. We did things of that sort. And I was lucky enough to be one of the documentary photographers for the project, so I got to really get a very wide view of the project.
How did you come to do this exhibition here at Cedar?
Well, as I said, a bunch of us who were alumni of the project thought we've got to do something so the project isn't forgotten. And by then we were up to maybe approaching the 40th anniversary of the project. So we came together, we began to do research, we went to the New York City archives, we began to talk to people about possibilities, and eventually we hooked up with City Lore and Place Matters, who are very much dedicated to community arts, or arts aimed at the community. And even better, we were hooked up with their archivist, Molly Garfinkel, who helped us organize our process, who began to think about how to do an exhibition, who began to think about how to do some fundraising. And all of that ended up with this exhibition called Artwork, which opened in December, partly here at the City Lore Gallery, and another part of it was at the Cuchifritos Gallery in the Essex Market.
And tell us, what was the reception? Did you get a lot of the Cedar artists coming around to see the work and be reminded of those days?
Oh yeah, certainly. The great majority of people who came to the receptions were former Cedar artists. And I'm very impressed that so many of us are still alive, healthy and active over 40 years later, right? I mean, we've lost a few, but all of the major administrators are still going. John Creedle, John Kreidler, I have to cut that. John Kreidler, who I said created the whole idea of doing Cedar Arts, came in from San Francisco. He's young, healthy, and active. We were very happy to discover that. So yeah, it definitely was a good time for Cedar artists and administrators to get together again. But ultimately we want to aim for a larger audience. And I want to reemphasize, CETA was not an arts project, right? For the most part, CETA was an employment project and training project and employed millions of people. But among those millions of people, 20,000 people were artists and workers in arts institutions. So even though we were a minority of the total, this was still the largest project supporting artists since the 1930s.
What killed it?
What killed it was essentially a move to the right in government, the election of Ronald Reagan, who particularly despised CETA and wanted to be sure that it was eliminated before the end of his first year in office.
Get your own job.
Get your own job. Government has no business employing people.
And it ended suddenly.
It ended rather suddenly. It was clear the end was coming. Most projects phased out from around 1980, the beginning of 1980, and by early 1981 it was entirely closed. Yeah.
Is it possible something like that could happen again?
Well, that's what we hope, and that's what we've been working for. Part of what the CETA Arts Legacy Project has been doing is trying to publicize the fact that a good solution exists, and they can come look at it, they can study it, they can figure out how to do this, right? It's already been invented. It can be put in place, and again, although everybody knows about the WPA, almost nobody knows about the CETA Arts programs, and they are much more recent, and they are much more, shall I say, amenable to the political realities at this time. So we in fact have been in touch with various legislators who have come to us for guidance in creating legislation. We've worked with the people that have put together the $125 million Creatives Rebuild New York project, giving them a lot of information, and they give us credit for giving them some good ideas about how to structure their program. So yeah, we not only want to talk about this thing that happened 40 years ago, we want it to be used as a model for basically bringing back the cultural sector that was so devastated by the pandemic.
Great. Anything like to add?
We're moving on for bigger and better shows. We're getting some funding so that we can do a whole set of shows up and down the Eastern Seaboard in 2026, which will be the semi-quincentennial of the Declaration of Independence. So we're hopeful that we will be able to get funding and just inform the people about what the possibilities are for their government to make life in this country just a lot more interesting.
Let them talk if they want to. Talk don't bother